Hey there guys, we're taking a look at Sekiro Shadows Die Twice running on the AMD Ryzen 550-500U. Now the game is currently running at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we have the TDP set to the stock 15-watt TDP that this system comes with. Now this is after all the boosts have ended, so we're getting pretty much just the sustained stock setting, which is of course 15 watts. Now we are pairing this with 16 gigabytes of dual channel DDR4 memory running at 3200 mega transfers per second. Overall, the performance that we're getting here is looking pretty mediocre because of those 1% lows and averages not being exactly great. The averages would be passable if it wasn't for the fact that those 1% lows are pretty brutal, and if you look at the frame time charts, there will be noticeable moments of spikes. And with that being the case, overall, I really just would not recommend running the game like this. There are ways to try to improve the overall performance here though. What we can do is adjust the TDP or adjust the resolution. So we're going to start with messing around with the TDP. As you can see here, with the game running at 25 watts at 1080p, we are seeing no noticeable uplift whatsoever. Really, overall, the performance that we're getting here is not far at all from where we were at the stock TDP. So in general, the experience is not going to be a doable one. You would have to be pretty desperate to try to play this game at 1080p to really stomach through this, because it makes doing things like parries very, very difficult at time. Especially with having such an inconsistent frame rate, it really makes it super difficult to time them sometimes. Now, in general, I'm also really bad at Soulsborne type games, and Sekiro seems to be one of the more brutal ones, at least for me, just in the sense that the gameplay itself is just so good, but it does have a lot of like mastering it in it. It reminds me a lot of Neo, which is another franchise that I struggled tremendously with. These really just do not seem to be my type of game, but in general, Sekiro seems to be the one that I've enjoyed the most. I love the setting, I love the aesthetic of it, and the gameplay is just so good. Like, I've enjoyed this more than any Dark Souls game that I played, and in some ways even more than Elden Ring. Though to be fair, I haven't dug too deep into Elden Ring. And of course, you'll see here that with the 30-watt TDP, we are pretty much not seeing too much of a major improvement here. Our averages are now starting to get into the mid 30s, but that really doesn't do much when our 1% lows got a whole uplift up to 20, which means we are still running into some pretty noticeable drops, and you'll see that the frame times are anything but consistent, with very large waves happening very, very frequently and walls of just spikes that end up happening. In general, not going to be a very smooth and consistent experience, and I really would just recommend avoiding adjusting your TDP to try to salvage 1080p here. It's just not doable. With that being said though, what we can start to do now is try to adjust the resolution. So we could drop things down to 900p to see what that actually does for our performance. And of course, at 900p, you can see here that the level of performance that we're getting is not looking that much better at all, really, at least at the stock 15-watt TDP. And I think that the 15-watt TDP is really just being a limiting factor here at this point. And you can clearly tell by the fact that the GPU clocks are not hitting very high at all. We are pretty much at a very rough spot right now, and in general, it makes the whole gaming experience very difficult. So it might be looking like, at least in terms of 900p and 1080p, the stock 15-watt is just not going to be able to keep up with the performance of the game. Now, if we adjust the TDP to 25 watts, you can now see here what it does to our performance, and we are getting a decent uplift in terms of our averages, though not a big jump in our 1% lows. It is now getting into a far more playable range, but we're still a little bit below where I would like to be. We're a little bit missing the mark overall, but you can see that there is the potential at least to get to a far more playable territory. But in general, those frame times are still looking very rough, with very noticeable spikes happening all over the place. So it's certainly a lot more playable, but I think most people are going to find themselves having trouble, especially with things like parries. This is just one of those situations where you're kind of signing yourself up to be in one of those moments where you're about to just kill the boss and you're a hit away from killing them, but you're also a hit away from dying, and a lag spike at the worst possible time could just ruin the timing of a parry, and that's it. Now, if we turn things up to 30 watts, you can see here that we're actually starting to get a lot more reasonable performance. With 1% lows that are essentially at 30 and averages that are in the mid 40s, we're pretty much going to be having a much nicer experience overall than where we were at before, but you'll still see that those frame times are kind of all over the place. Those spikes are very noticeable, and in general, it does still affect the gameplay, though not to the point where I feel like you're gonna have an impossible time playing. This is something where you're just gonna have to adjust to, and you're also gonna have to accept the fact that sometimes it's going to be a rough experience. You can try to do it like this, but there will be those moments of sudden drop, so in general, it's not going to be the most consistent experience. But now that we're teetering at the edge of playability, we might actually be able to get this to a playable state with a little bit more resolution adjustments. And 720p does not seem to do as much as I was really hoping it would actually end up doing, at least at the stock 15-watt TDP. And like I mentioned before, I think that the 15-watt TDP is just very limited because we run into the same issues that we always run into, which are struggling 1% lows. You will see that our frame times are better than where we were at 900p and at 1080p, but not significantly so. You will still see those major spikes that end up happening that end up being very noticeable in terms of the gameplay, though like I mentioned before, at 900p, this is pretty much teetering at the edge of playability. In fact, I think a lot of you guys could probably get away with playing like this perfectly fine. It's just those moments of stutter that actually end up dragging the whole experience down, but I think we might be able to alleviate that. So at the 25-watt TDP that you're looking at now, you can see that our 1% lows saw a bit of an improvement, though nothing major. Our averages are looking pretty solid, and our frame times are looking much better than they were before, though you will still notice that there are minor spikes. It's nothing as severe as what we've seen before. They are much smaller waves, much smaller spikes than what we were looking at before, where it was sometimes noticeably almost like waves in a wall going on sometimes. And really overall, that makes the experience a lot rougher, but here it's a lot smoother. We are of course still getting those fluctuations, but they are a lot more manageable here. And really just the fact that our 1% lows are staying comfortably above 30 pretty much means that we are having at least a pretty rock solid experience. Though again, the frame times are not going to be perfect. This is pretty much about as good as it's realistically going to get. We can of course go all the way up to 30-watt TDP, but as always, I preface this, do not use that 30-watt TDP if you do not have a system that can properly cool it. My system pretty much just cannot do it really sustained. It gets into temperatures that I just personally don't feel comfortable using a budget system at. But you can see here at the 30-watt TDP that this is about as good of an experience as we're going to be able to get out of this, where our 1% lows are at least staying above 30. Our averages are flirting with 60, which means that we're pretty much there. We're gonna have a pretty rock solid experience like this. It's just one of those things where those temperatures are not looking good, and we're pretty much getting the same level of performance that we were at the 25-watt TDP. The improvements overall that we're getting by those extra 5 watts are really not as noticeable as the temperature increase that ends up coming along with it. Now again, it's nothing substantial in terms of gains, so I really just would suggest avoiding using this preset at all costs. It is the smoothest experience technically speaking because there is at least some improvement, but it is going to be very unnoticeable compared to the increased noise that this system makes. It gets to the point at this point where it's just blasting at such a loud volume that I personally find it annoying to have right next to me. So it's something to think about when you're thinking about the TDP that you're going to be running your system at. Maybe a quieter experience is going to be worth a hit to the performance. Just a thought there. But anyways, I hope you guys found this video useful. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.